If you're wondering, or if you're watching online, yes, I had a bike crash. Not that big a deal. Cuts, scratches, scrapes, popped my nose back in place, and it's not so. It looks worse than it was. But if you're going to play, sometimes you're going to pay. That's just part of life, and so that's the story I'm telling. My wife may tell a different one. In Genesis chapter 27, verse 41, we read this: "Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, 'The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob.'" Now, this is not the first family to experience discord. I think sometimes we get the idea that broken families, dysfunctional families is like a more modern kind of experience, but man, it goes all the way back to the beginning. Matter of fact, it goes like all the way back to the beginning. Adam and Eve, they ate from the banana tree, and what's the first thing Adam did? Blamed Eve. There've been discord for a long time in families. And then, of course, they had sons, and one of their sons killed another one of their sons. So the idea of brothers hating one another goes back to the earliest parts of the Bible, and unfortunately has been around through all of history. And so Esau has made a commitment to murder his brother Jacob. The hatred, the rage, because basically Jacob has swindled his brother twice. Swindled him out of his inheritance when they were young, and then swindled him out of his father's blessing. And so because of that, Jacob has fled and spent more than 2 decades in another part of the world. And now he is headed home, and he is going to meet his brother Esau in Genesis 33. So let's see what happens when these two brothers meet for the first time after all these years. Genesis chapter 33. The Bible says that Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants. And he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. Now, Jacob is afraid, and he has every right and reason to be afraid. Esau has said, "I'm going to kill him." And now he gets, he's heard, but now he sees that his brother's coming with 400 men, and he assumes that he's coming to make good on his pledge. So what in the world does Jacob do? Verse 2 is important. The end of verse 1 and verse 2, and there's a lot here. So let's get a quick background. Jacob has married 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel. Leah's having children, Rachel's not. So Rachel gives her servant to Jacob so that the children will be considered hers. And then Leah stops having children, gives her servant. So now we have 4 ladies. Eventually Rachel's going to give birth. So we have 4 women who have produced 11 sons between them. So we have Bilhah and Zilpah, the servants, and then we have Leah and Rachel, who are the sisters. Okay? Now, I worked on this. I couldn't figure out a way to say this that's going to come out right. So if you would please just understand the spirit with which I'm about to say this. In my experience, I have discovered that 1 wife is enough. So I, again, just understand what I mean by that, and I'll say no more. But he has 2 wives, and then the 2 servants, we have all 4 of them. But notice what he does. He puts the servants, Bilhah and Zilpah, with their children out front. Then Leah with her children. Then lastly, Rachel and Joseph, the only son that she's had at this point. Rachel will later give birth to another son, Benjamin, to round out the 12 tribes of Israel, the dirty dozen. And so, but at this point we have the 11. Now, by looking at the order in which he places them, who is the least important? The servants and their children. Then who's next? Leah and her children. And then who is most important? Rachel and Joseph. Now, when you look at this, one of the things you notice is, now we see why Joseph turned out to be such a twerp. I mean, he was just an arrogant, pompous, rubbing his brother's face kind of twerp. I mean, that's just, and no wonder he's told even this early, it's like, oh, you're special. You're more important than all the rest of the brothers. You're the one who really counts, all that sort of thing. But can you imagine being, I mean, one of the servants, that's bad. Can you imagine being Leah? Can you imagine Jacob surviving all of this and then going to Leah? I'm telling you what, if I was him, I wouldn't eat her cooking for months. There's no telling what she'd put in it. I'm thinking this conversation is probably not, there's just no way to have a good conversation at this point. Well, I don't love you as much as Rachel, but you know, you were behind the servants. Yeah, like that's going to help. I just cannot even imagine what it was like. Listen, I don't even want to, and to be one of the sons. Can you imagine? You're one of the servants' sons and you're out in front. You're the one that's going to be killed first because you know that dad just thinks you're the least important. And then at some point, dad comes to you and says, I just want you to know how proud I am of you. You're thinking, yeah, right. I mean, you talk about dysfunctional family, a broken family. So Jacob has clearly communicated to the women and to their children who is important or who is more important than the others. But I am going to give him some credit. Verse 3. At least he acts like a man and goes out front himself. Okay, now men, I'm going to give you another shot here. At least he decides to act like a man and go out in front of the rest of them. Oh, that was pathetic. Don't we got some real men in here? I mean, he decides to be a man and go out front himself. And so he goes out before all of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he comes near to his brother. Now, all of this activity in these 3 verses is based on the fear that Jacob has of what Esau is going to do to him, the threat that Esau has made against him. And to somehow think that fear is not normal and natural and needed is simply not correct. The Bible recognizes fear. As a matter of fact, the word fear occurs 353 times in the Bible. The word afraid occurs 167 times, for a grand total of 520 times the Bible talks about us being afraid. Fear is something that's a part of it. As a matter of fact, Psychology Today put it this way: fear is a vital response to physical and emotional danger. If we didn't feel it, we couldn't protect ourselves from legitimate threats. There are many people who realize there should be some fear, not, oh gee, isn't that a pretty little rattle on the end of that snake? I mean, fear is something that God has given us to help us to protect ourselves. And so it makes sense that Jacob is afraid of what Esau is going to do. And so he is afraid. What in the world is going to happen? But beginning of verse 4, we're going to see that Esau comes with forgiveness. The Bible says that Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please. If I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. Now, the first thing about forgiveness is that it needs to be genuine. And this is genuine forgiveness. Notice what happens. Esau ran to him. Now, because I'm a visual learner, I just picture things in my head, and I'm just picturing Jacob seeing Esau running, thinking, what's he going to do? I mean, Esau's running. He's just waiting for him to pull out the knife. I'm sure Jacob is, why is he running at me? And then when Esau gets there and he hugs him and then he kisses him and they weep, and Jacob now realizes that Esau has forgiven him. And so the forgiveness that Esau extends is genuine. It involves hugging and kissing and weeping, and Jacob may be weeping as much out of relief as anything else at this point, because he realizes that he's going to survive. Then notice how full it is. It involves not just Jacob, but all of his family. When Esau lifted up his eyes, saw this people, the women and children, said, "And who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Now notice what happens. We have the servants draw near and their children then Leah and her. And so we have a parade of 15 people that come by, at least 15, who come by. And Jacob's like, well, this is Zilpah and her, and this is Bilhah and hers, and this is Leah and hers. And I don't know about you, but I'm thinking if I'm Esau, I'm not keeping all these names straight. Because there's a whole parade of all these people. And so, because he's never met any of Jacob's family, they haven't seen each other in over 20 years. And so all of them come by and he introduces each one of them. Now in verse 8, Esau asks a question. He says, what's all this stuff that I met? Now, if you go back a couple of chapters, you discover that Jacob had sent a whole bunch of livestock as gifts to Esau to try to, for lack of a better description, pay off Esau so he'd no longer be angry. But Esau says, nope, I have enough. I don't need anything from you. The reason this is so important is because forgiveness, real, genuine forgiveness, cannot be bought. You can't buy it from someone. And so Esau, I think, wants to make clear to Jacob, I'm not forgiving you because you've given me all this livestock. I'm forgiving you because I am forgiving you. And so then they have a discussion about whether or not Esau is going to accept it. And when these situations arise, somebody's got to give in. Somebody's got to either say, okay, I'll take it back, or okay, I'll take it. And so finally, at the end of verse 11, Esau says, okay, I'll take it. Now, when we talk about forgiveness, there are a couple of different types, and it's interesting how we tend to think in terms of forgiveness. When we hear about forgiveness, oftentimes what we think of are the smaller things, the easier things when it comes to forgiveness. A couple weeks ago, we were at a baseball game, and a couple of times I felt like water drops, and I told myself, it must be condensation or something. Then about halfway through the game, security comes down. They're talking to some people that kind of over to our left, and I figure out somebody's been throwing stuff off of one of the upper decks down on us. And so the security talks to them, and then they leave. And man, it isn't too long, and this man comes down with his son. And the boy's, 8, 9 years old. And he makes the boy apologize to the people. Now, when he was leaving, I just said, good job, Dad. Because that was a good job. Made his son come down and apologize. Well, let's be honest. Those people, pretty easy to forgive an 8-year-old boy if throwing water off the top deck. I mean, that's what 8-year-old boys do. Oh, please. Some of you look at me like, I wouldn't forgive him. Man, I'd never throw water off that. I'm glad your memory is so bad. I mean, this is what boys do, and it's not that big a deal to forgive a young boy of just being silly at a ball game and throwing some water off the deck. It's not that big a deal. So sometimes when we hear forgiveness, that's what we think of. We think, well, yeah, I can forgive, and I've forgiven plenty in my life, and that's it. But even really bad people, even maybe not the worst of people, but like the almost worst of people can forgive a little boy for just acting like a boy. But there's a whole nother level of forgiveness. And that's what we're facing here. And that's when someone has really hurt us. I mean, they have really, really impacted our life. What they have done has in some cases even changed the direction of our life. And we're thinking, no, I'm not forgiven. I'm not going to forgive it. I mean, it's really interesting about the way that forgiveness works and what forgiveness does to us. You see, an unforgiving spirit is like carrying a burden. And we carry this load with us. And the fascinating thing is the longer we carry it, the heavier it gets. The more difficult it is to carry, but the more difficult it is to let it go. And we carry it, and there's anger and bitterness and hurt and betrayal. And what's so interesting is when you are carrying an unforgiving spirit, you are not hurting that person at all. You're only hurting yourself. You're the one who is carrying the burden. You're the one who is carrying this heavy load. And what you need to do is you need to forgive. You need to let the burden go. You need to take it off. You need to let it drop. You need to let it go. You need to let go of your anger and your bitterness and your hatred. You need to let go of all those emotions you've had and say, you know what? I'm going to forgive them. When I talk like this, there are a couple of questions that come to people's minds. And normally the one at the top of the list is, are you telling me that I have to forgive them and try to make things like they used to be? No, it's not what I'm telling you. Listen, if he's cheating on you and you forgive him and he continues to cheat and you forgive, you need to kick him out. Let the axe drop. Okay? Forgiveness doesn't mean I'm going to let you just run over and mistreat me. You got a family member that has been abusing a child, you can forgive, but you do not let them around that child alone, ever. Okay? So, yes, we can forgive by letting go of the anger and the hatred, but there are some consequences to actions that people have. And we get that, and I get that. So don't think I'm saying that, I got to forgive and I got to put this family member or myself back into a dangerous situation. That's not biblical at all. Okay, everybody, so you understand what I'm saying? But the idea of harboring hate, here's what's amazing. There are people who are going around today with an unforgiving spirit, and the person they hate and are angry toward is not even aware of it. You've been bitter for 25 years, but man, she got over it. She's moved on. All right? She broke up with you. It was the 11th grade. Let it go already. Just let it go. I mean, you're just carrying stuff. I mean, it's astounding how people have allowed bitterness to destroy themselves, and the person that they're bitter at has no idea even what's happened. They've gone on. And so what I'm saying is, let go of the bitterness. Now, sometimes forgiveness also means we need to reach out to restore a relationship. And in Genesis 33, that's what we find. There's not just forgiveness, but there's also going to be restoration. They're going to fellowship with one another. Look at what it says, verse 12. Then Esau said, man, let's journey on our way. I will go ahead of you. Now let's travel together. So verse 13, Jacob said to him, my Lord knows that the children are frail, that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and at the pace of the children until I come to my Lord in Seir, which is where Esau's from. So Esau said, let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. But he said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth, which means booth. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Yisrael, which is God, the God of Israel. Recognize that God's once taking care of him. Now Esau says, man, let's travel together. It's not just enough to forgive. He says, I want to have fellowship. I want us to spend time together. Let's journey together. But in reality, it's just not practical. Jacob has these four women with all their small children, and then he's got livestock, and they're going to move at a slow pace. Esau has 400 grown men. They're going to move at a pretty quick pace. And so Jacob says, we're just not going to be able to match your pace, and you don't be held back by us. Now I want to inject something here that has nothing to do with the sermon or the passage at all, but just want to say, sometimes in life, you need to learn to travel at someone else's pace. You don't need your young children to try to get through the store at your speed. Sometimes when you hike, you just need to move at someone else's pace and not your own pace. So sometimes in life, it would be good for some of us to slow down and move sometimes at other people's pace. I thought somebody here would go, just look, you're not going to say amen, you're just going to look at your spouse and say, are you listening? And I want you to listen at your pace so that someday you can walk at my pace. So he said, we're not going to travel at the same speed. So Esau with his 400, y'all going to make great time so y'all can go. And Jacob says, we'll get there eventually. So Esau says, well, if that's the case, let me give some people to help protect you. So he says, let me leave with you some of the people for your safety. But Jacob says, I don't need them. Not only do I have all my family, but I've got all my servants they're the ones who are working the flocks, and so they would be able to serve as well. And so Esau says, okay, then we'll head back. Now all that sounds really awesome, except for now we see in verse 17, Jacob doesn't travel to Seir. He doesn't go to where his brother Esau is. Instead, he gets to Sukkoth, and there he stops and builds some booths for his livestock. I wonder how many of you have ever had your plans change? Okay, we're going to have a confession service, and so if you didn't raise your hand, lying is a sin. Everybody has had their plans changed at some point in their life. That's really not true. There are some people who never have their plans changed because they never make any plans at all. I don't know how they function in life and get through life, but there's some people that seem to just never plan for anything. And I just simply do not comprehend that at all. We should plan to talk about it. And so the plan was to go to Seir, but the plans have changed. And so he stops at Sukkoth. But not only does he stop at Sukkoth, but now in verse 18, at some point he goes a little further, comes to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, a very important statement. He has been gone for all these years, and now he's returned to the land that God has promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He's promised to give him this land and to his descendants. So he comes to the land of Canaan on his way from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. Now, verse 19 may not sound important, but it's very important even for today. From the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he was camping, on which he had pitched his tent. Now, why is that so important? Well, God made a promise all the way back in Genesis 12 that he would give to Abraham's descendants this land. If God's going to give it to you, why would you buy it? So 3 times in the Old Testament, a piece of the promised land is actually purchased. 3 times. Now you remember that God does give it to him. Moses takes them to the land. You've seen the 10 Commandments or the Prince of Egypt or something, right? Or read it in the Bible. So Moses gets them there. Then or Joshua, they go in and they take the land. God gives them this land. But 3 times a piece of property is bought. Right? The first time, Abraham buys a piece of land outside the city of Hebron, the field of Machpelah, where there is a cave. And it's there that he wants to bury Sarah and then eventually to be buried himself. That's found in Genesis chapter 23. So you can read that account where Abraham buys a piece of the land outside of Hebron. Next is found here in Genesis chapter 33, verse 18 and 19, where Jacob buys a piece of land in Shechem. Now the modern day name, Arabic name for Shechem is Nablus. And then the third time that a piece of land is bought is in 1 Chronicles 21, where David buys the threshing floor of Ornan on what eventually will be called Mount Moriah, on which was built by his son the temple. So Hebron, Shechem, and now a piece of Jerusalem where the Temple Mount would be. Why does that have so much significance for today? Because these are considered the 3 holiest sites in the land of Israel. And because of where politics is, they are also the 3 most contentious sites in the land of Israel, even today. And so all 3 of them are considered very, very, very sacred and very, very significant because they're the only 3 pieces of land that were purchased in the Old Testament. All the rest of the land was given by God to his people. And so Jacob buys this piece of land outside of Shechem for Hamor, and there he builds an altar because he recognizes that all of this, the change in Esau's heart, getting back, getting here safely, all of this is because God, the God of Israel, is the one who's taking care of him. You and I don't just get lucky. You and I have God watching over us. And so he recognizes that God is the one who did it. Esau and Jacob have been enemies. Jacob goes from fearing his brother to fellowship with his brother because of forgiveness that has been granted by his brother. It was interesting. World War I, probably the worst war that's ever been fought in history. It was the first war where there was extensive use of chemical warfare. The front lines moved only a few miles throughout the entire war. Soldiers died by the tens of thousands from diseases they contracted in the trenches, not from enemy bullets, but just from diseases and from chemical warfare and all kinds. It was just a horrible, horrible war, unlike any other that has ever been fought in history. There are a number of stories from World War I about commanders that on Christmas Eve met with the commander of the opposing forces in the trench opposite them, and they agreed to suspend hostilities for Christmas Day because Jesus is the Prince of Peace. And so they would send that. But it's really interesting what they discovered. It didn't work. The reason it didn't work was because they discovered that if they spent an entire day of Christmas together, they could not go back to viewing each other as the enemy. Esau has forgiven his brother. They will not go back to being enemies. They are now brothers. They are now ready to fellowship together. Isn't that great? That's the power of forgiveness. Now, there's something interesting. There are a lot of things about forgiveness that are interesting, but one of the things that's really fascinating is all of us, as we move through life, have times when we need to forgive someone. I'm not talking about to the huddle of the holy here. All right? All of you have done things for which you need to ask forgiveness. What's interesting is all of us also have had things done to us for which we need to give forgiveness. So as we move through life, we need both to forgive others, but also to be forgiven for others. And that's true for everyone who's ever lived, with one exception: Jesus. Jesus has never done anything for which he needs to ask forgiveness. Hello? Jesus, there's nothing for which we forgive Jesus. He has never done anything. Jesus' forgiveness only runs in one direction. And that is, he forgives us for what we have done. We understand the need to forgive because we understand the need to be forgiven. Jesus forgives one direction only. And Jesus' forgiveness is complete. You know what happens when Jesus forgives you? You go from being his enemy to being his friend. Living in fellowship with him. Given the promise of eternal fellowship with him in a place called heaven. By the way, this is why it's called the good news. This is why I think we should be a happy church. At least smile and fake it. I mean, we have been forgiven. We're not a gathering of the super godly. We are a gathering of people who have been forgiven. And our message is, in Jesus Christ, you can be forgiven too. That's why it's the good news. And if truth be told, you know as well as I do, your list of the things you've done wrong, the laws of God you have violated is a lengthy list. And the forgiveness of Jesus is longer than your sin list. It goes deeper than any pit you could dig yourself into. It is the good news that Jesus died on the cross and rose again so that you and I can be forgiven. Here's what that means. If we have experienced the forgiveness of Jesus, we need to extend that forgiveness to those who have wronged us. We need to lay it down. We need to drop the burden, lay down the load. We have been forgiven. We in turn now need to forgive. I mean, really, genuinely forgive. Our Heavenly Father, I thank you that in Jesus Christ we can be not like sort of forgiven or partially forgiven, but completely forgiven. We can be washed, cleansed, redeemed, born again, all the different ways that's described in your word. And God, I thank you that in Jesus Christ I can say I am forgiven forever. And Father, I pray that as I have experienced that forgiveness, you would help me to lay down the burden, to not carry a spirit of unforgiveness, but be willing to forgive even as I have been forgiven. For it is in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.